so I guess I'll talk a little bit about how I came about making these pieces to begin with, and then I'll talk a little bit about the content of the work itself. So, start by saying that normally a lot of my older work a couple of years ago were these really, really controlled, very tightly drawn lithographs. So where I would plan out exactly where every color was going, where every image was going, and like the images were so planned that after doing them for a couple of years, they got really stale for me. And I think it's like when you know the results of something, especially with printmaking as a process, you're kind of just working towards this goal of it being finished. So if you start with like an image in mind and you're just kind of filling in the space until the image is complete. And so you're looking at the same image over and over and over, and it doesn't really bring a whole lot of new information to the table when you're kind of working that way. So you're just kind of starting with a goal and finishing it, right? And a lot of the discovery is kind of missing from that sort of process. So while I've been printing those lithographs, I've been proofing colors on separate sheets of paper from print to print. I would actually accidentally layer old information from old prints on top of a new print. So then there were these figures and things interacting on a plane from like two different stories, I guess you could say, and it brought about this whole new narrative to the pieces. And so I think it's kind of interesting that Caroline and I paired up because she's talking about storytelling, and it's something that I'm interested in as well, kind of narrative and storytelling in a way. So I started thinking about where I could actually take that sort of like unexpected layering of things to create a new narrative that which I would have to work with to create another piece. So I started with 100 sheets of paper that are all these like 22 by 30 sizes, and to try to kind of disconnect myself from like choosing what information was going on and what. I had carved out, there's probably, so all these little, like these darker pieces, more graphic pieces are all relief blocks that have all been cut out of a big sheet. And so there's probably like 120, 130 of those as well. They're separate pieces, and I kind of put them in categories of information like figures, like heads, limbs, like body parts, or animals, or weapons, or insects, things like that, and place them in different piles. And then I assign those numbers, and then used a random number generator to actually pick which pieces would be going onto each sheet of paper. So I would just stack up the sheets of 100 and run three pieces on each piece of paper through the press until I got through the whole stack. And then I'd go back into that and I'd respond to the way that those three pieces interacted, and I'd do some drawing or some painting or some transfers of some images. And initially, the plan was that these would all be 100 different pieces. And I was thinking that they were just going to be, those were going to be the finished products. But then I started getting interested in how all those pieces could start interacting on a larger scale, and something that pushed into your space and kind of made it something that was a more like kind of all-encompassing sort of world that you had to kind of be confronted by and kind of interact with. So there's way more than 100 sheets now, and there's probably closer to 200 sheets of paper. So I think I brought this up to Ken, but my plan initially was to actually leave no white space in this gallery. It was going to be like, these panels were going to fill up every section of the wall, so it was like an entire environment that you walked into. But due to some time constraints and other things, that didn't quite happen. But I kind of actually I think maybe like baby steps in that direction is good for me, because I kind of like these moments where you can like stop and breathe between pieces. It's kind of, there's a lot of information in these, and so it might be a little overwhelming to walk into a room that is just all this stuff just bombarding you, right? But also I think it's important that eventually I do get to that space where I see how that feels different from these. So then I guess I'll talk a little bit. That's kind of how I came about making all these. So I'll talk a little bit now about kind of the content. Initially, so these are actually kind of out of order for me a bit. So this panel here would actually, I wanted it to kind of read left to right. So this panel would have been the first panel, this would have been the second, and then this would have been the last. And so a lot of the imagery that I'm using is, you'll often hear me talk about archetypes with my work. And so archetypes, if you don't know, they're kind of like these threads of kind of like known symbols and imagery, or like threads through like stories that we all kind of identify with, even though we don't know the name for them necessarily, but you see certain symbols and you kind of identify those things with something. So usually like stories and fables and stuff like that all have like archetypes that kind of run through them. And one that I'm particularly kind of interested in is the hero's journey, to an extent, and so that's kind of, that might have a lot to do with the fact that what got me started with art to begin with was comic books, reading a lot of comic books, and so a lot of those like kind of themes run through comic books, right? Like good and evil, like this hero's journey, having this immense amount of power and like using it for like good or evil, those sorts of things. And I mean, I wouldn't say this is like a comic book story, but it definitely takes like influence from like kind of the themes that runs through those. And you'll even see some comic book imagery kind of referenced throughout here, usually with like pieces of that story that I feel like are relevant to the panel itself. So this is, for me, this story that I'm trying to tell is actually kind of like, I don't know if it's a person or multiple people, and it's kind of this theme of like getting power and then not knowing what to do with power, or like how to, like wanting to hold on to it, and then the inevitable demise of this person or this thing. And I think if you look through, there's a lot of images that relate to masculinity, and such as like the buffalo or whale. There's like these like power animals, and then there's a lot of things that are kind of related to like death and kind of sadness in a way in a lot of these. And so this panel here is kind of what I see as this person, like, so this is gaining power, this is having power, and kind of the confusion that comes along with it, and kind of like this need to want to maintain it, and maybe some of the like the downfalls that might come from that. So I was also brought up Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore, but I think a lot of the symbols that I use in that often relate to Catholicism and like Christian symbols, and such as like the hornets are kind of like this evil like sort of symbol for me, and other things like when you get into this panel here, which is kind of like my death panel, or I'm trying to use images of like kind of like plague and things like that. So like the big locust in the middle is like a really strong symbol for me that's been coming out a lot lately, and kind of like this like burning downfall of this character. So I could talk more, but I don't want it to get like too jumbled. I feel like I'm starting to jump all over the place. So
I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is your oldest piece, right?
Yeah.
Is this the project where you started with the 100 pieces
Yes.
of work? Are these two pieces a continuation of that, or are they separate?
They're continuation, so it's kind of building off of what I already had.
Okay.
It's like a groundwork, and So this was, like, when I first made this, I might have been, like, I knew kind of what I was making, but it was still kind of figuring out what it was saying overall. And I think I have a little more solid understanding of, like, what that is now, to where that these coming after that are just, like, informing this piece more for me.
Okay.
And I guess I didn't really speak about what's different about these is I guess the physical element in this one. And that, when I was kind of piecing this together in the studio, I had this gap in the space, and normally I'm compelled to fill things in, right, too, as maybe you can tell. But I really enjoyed that white space, and I started thinking about what sort of physical elements I could put in that also relate to this. So there are, like, these are railroad spikes, but they're the dirtiest, closest looking thing that I could get to, like, really big nails.
Yeah.
They're not quite as menacing as I want them down at the bottom, but so there are, like, kind of nails used throughout the pieces if you search for them, but they're there. And then the six, the number 6 for me is kind of, it's going back to that kind of, like, Christian numerology, right? So 6 for me is a little bit of evil / it's also on the 6th day is, like, when man was created, right? So that number relates a lot to man for me personally.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
How did you decide to separate out those 3 to represent individually as one single piece?
I guess I didn't talk about this. So, like I said, when I was making the 100 to begin with, I had initially thought that each one was going to be its own piece, and so when it got to a point where I started piecing these together, there's a lot that aren't here, and there's a lot of them that I feel operate really well as their own kind of narrative, and then there's some that I feel like need the rest of these pieces to kind of complete the story, whereas these I feel like they're finished on their own and that they don't need these extra things to kind of inform the rest of the piece. But it is kind of weird because I initially thought that this could constantly morph and change, where, like, each time I showed it would be different. Like, the pieces would move around, but now I've gotten attached a little bit to, like, the way that it tells the story specifically, especially once you start drawing across panels and connecting information. But then it takes these away, right, from ever being part of that story again. So it's like removing information that could have been a possibility to be another piece, right? So it's like taking away that information forever, which I haven't thought too much about, but it's definitely, it's removed for forever.
Yeah.
I mean, I could take it out of the frame, but probably not gonna happen.
Any other questions?